Okay, so we're just going to try to make some progress today. I think we're going to look at verse 7 and 8. But before we do 7 and 8, we want to give a little summary just of the basic story. In other words, there's just the flow of the story. So for that, we'll share the screen. We'll go to the actual verses. And last week we looked all the way. We're up to verse 6. We concluded verse 6. So the beginning of verse 1 is an introduction. Verse 2 and 3 and 4 is the woman talking to her beloved. Verse 5 and 6 is the young woman talking to the other girls of Jerusalem. In other words, in the beginning, she talks about her love to her beloved, and then she starts telling to the other girls, "Don't judge me. I am black but comely, O daughters of Jerusalem." In other words, don't judge me that I'm dark. Verse 6, "Do not look upon me disdainfully because I am swarthy, for the sun has gazed upon me." So we have the conversation about her love to her beloved. That's verse 2 to verse 4. And then verse 5 and 6 is to the other daughters of Jerusalem, which we explained, according to Rashi, refers to the nations of the world. According to the spiritual perspective, it refers to the other forces within the person's psyche. In other words, the body and the animal soul. And according to the Kabbalistic interpretation, verse 5 and 6 refers is the soul down here talking to the souls that are in heaven. Okay, now now the story shifts a little bit. Now she's going back and talking to her beloved. And she's asking a very simple question. And the question is, where are you? Right? Imagine you're trying you are dating somebody and the guy is not answering your phone calls, so not picking up your texts. She says, where are you? What's the problem? He says, where are you? I'm looking for you. Now, at this point, he is a shepherd. Either he's a shepherd or he's amongst the shepherds. It's not clear. It depends who you follow. But let's assume he's a shepherd right now. So she is saying, why do I have to walk around the fields looking amongst the other shepherds looking for you? Just tell me where you are. That's sort of the simple question. Now, what does he answer? Let's read the question. It's very nice. Tell me, you whom my soul loves. Verse 7, tell me, you whom my soul loves. Where do you feed? Where do you rest the flocks at noon? Right? So she wants to know two things. So first thing she's doing is the shepherd during the day is supposed to, the morning hours, feeds with the sheep, takes the sheep to the feeding, so they're more on the move. But if you live in the Middle East, in the middle of the day, you're not on the move. It's too hot. So middle of the day, you rest with the sheep. Hopefully you can find some shade. So that's what she's saying. In the beginning, she says, beginning of verse 7, where do you feed? Where are you going? Where are you traveling to? And then the verse continues, where do you rest the flocks at noon? For why should I be like the one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? In other words, now she says, I got my own flock, I got my own sheep, and I'm looking for you, and I can't find you, so I end up resting with the other shepherds instead of with you. So basically, the simple question is, where are you? What's the answer? The answer is a very sad answer. Not sad answer. The answer is that at this point, he doesn't really tell her. He doesn't really say where he is. You'll see next week that instead of telling her, he writes her a few love letters. But he doesn't really tell her where he is, at least not yet. So if you look at verse 8 is the response. Finally, he is responding to her, not directly, not face to face, because she doesn't know where he is, but it's his voice talking. This is verse 8. If you do not know, O fairest of women, go your way in the footsteps of the flocks and pasture your kids besides the shepherd's dwellings. What is he really saying? He's saying, go look for me. You don't know where I am? Go follow your sheep and pasture your sheep, your kids, your young sheep, together with the other shepherds' dwellings. Okay, basically, sorry, I'm not telling you where I am, at least not yet. And that's part of the tension of the book, that she wants him, he's not always available. And as we continue, when we get to later chapters, sometimes he comes to her, but she's not available. So that's just part of the drama of the love story that's taking place here. So that is the simple story of the verses. Now we have a few minutes to look at Rashi, and we want to look at the Kabbalistic perspective, and then we have a revolutionary Hasidic perspective, which again turns everything on its head, because that's what we like to do. So that's just in short. That's just the introduction. Before we start, Lisa reminds me that we should dedicate the studying in the merit of the Jewish people in Israel for safe and peace and security. So let's do that. And then we can jump right in. Okay. So that's the basic plot. Now we're going to read Rashi. As is our custom, we'll open Rashi. We'll see what he says. Rashi's commentary show. Okay. We're up to verse 7. Tell me, you whom my soul loves. The divine spirit repeatedly compares her to the flock that is beloved to her shepherd. The congregation of Israel says before him, as a woman to her husband, tell me, you whom my soul loves, where do you feed your flock among these wolves in whose midst they are? And where do you rest them at noon in this exile, which is distressful time for them, like noon, which is a distressful time for the flock? So this is very interesting. What Rashi is saying is, we're referring to the Jewish people in exile, and the woman is talking to her husband and says, where are you? And where are you in the sense that why are you allowing your sheep to rest, to be in a distressful place? What is distress? Midday in the Middle East is the time of distress for the sheep. So he says, where are you? Why are you? Where are you when we are in distress? And then she says, for why should I be like the one who veils herself? And if you ask, what does it concern you? It is not dignified for you that I should be like a mourner with a veil over my lip, weeping for my flock, beside the flocks of your companions, beside the flocks of the other shepherds who pasture flocks as you do, i.e., among the flocks of the heathens who rely on pagan deities and who have kings and princes who lead them. So what's happening here, according to Rashi, is like this. The Jewish people in exile are asking God, where are you at midday? Midday is a time of distress. Where are you when we need you? Why am I here mourning veiled? Why am I here mourning veiled like in mourning amongst the other shepherds? Who are the other shepherds? The other shepherds are the pagans, the pagan nations who have foreign deities. That's according to Rashi. Again, Rashi does the historic perspective. What's the answer? What does the guy respond? He doesn't answer. We're still in exile. He says, the verse says, if you do not know, O fairest of women, go your way in the footsteps of the flocks. What does that mean? Says Rashi, this is the shepherd's reply. If you do not know where you should go feed your flock, you, O fairest of women, for the shepherd has ceased pasturing them. In other words, you don't know where to take your sheep because the shepherd's not here. You don't sense the presence of God. So the verse continues, go your way in the footsteps of the flocks. Look at the footsteps, the way that the flocks went, and heels and the heels are discernible. Traces in French tracks. There are many similar instances in Scripture. He will return his tracks, not go. Rashi is bringing many verses where the word for footsteps is really the tracks. In other words, follow the footsteps of the sheep. Who are the sheep? We're going to explain. And pasture your kids beside the shepherd's dwelling, among the dwellings of the other shepherds beside whom you are. And this is the allegory. If you do not know my assembly and my congregation, O fairest of women, the fairest of the nations, where you will pasture and be saved from the hand of those who oppress you, to be among them, and that your children should not perish, ponder the ways of your early ancestors who received my Torah and kept my watch and my commandments, and go in their ways. And as a reward for this, you will pasture your kids besides the princes of the nations. And so did Jeremiah say, set up markers for yourself, put your heart to the highway, etc. What is Rashi telling us? Rashi is telling us that the response from God to the Jewish people is, if you don't see the shepherd during exile, and you want to survive the exile, just follow the paths of your ancestors. Your ancestors kept the Torah, you keep the Torah. And if you follow the paths of your ancestors, even during exile, then you will survive even amongst the other nations, even amongst the other nations of the world. And Rashi concludes with a verse from Jeremiah where God says Hatzivi lach tziyunim. When you are in exile, make markers for yourself. In other words, distinguish yourself by keeping the Torah and performing the mitzvot, and then you will survive in the exile. So that is the historic perspective. Historic perspective is that she says, where are you? The shepherd's not here. Where is the shepherd? It's midday. There is distress. There is heat. And where I can't find you. And he responds, he doesn't tell her where he is. He just says, don't worry, you just follow the paths of the path of your ancestors, and you will survive the exile. So that's the historic perspective offered by Rashi. So let's close the Rashi, and then we'll look for a little bit of the Kabbalistic perspective, and then we'll get to the Hasidic perspective in the few minutes that are remaining. So the Kabbalistic perspective is as follows, very interesting. The question that the soul asks is, God, if you remember from the Kabbalistic perspective was, in the beginning, the tension is that the soul in the body understands that it cannot have awareness of God. It hopes for the time that it will be able to reunite with God and after the soul returns to heaven. But in this body, when the soul is in the body, it's limited by finite human consciousness, and it cannot really experience the true awareness of God. So that's why she says, according to the Kabbalistic interpretation, she says, look, I can smell you, I could smell the fragrance, I can have some understanding in your greatness, but I don't have the kiss, I don't have that intimacy. So following on that theme, the Kabbalistic perspective says, look, she says, where are you, God? We can't see God. And indeed, in the exile, in this world, there's two ways where you could see God, on two different distinct times. One time you could see God is when you see God through acting through nature. In other words, sometimes you have divine providence, you have things working out, you have the hand of God, and you feel, even though you don't see any open miracles, the sea is not splitting, but you feel that you're being led by the presence of God, that God is directing you in the right place. That is the metaphor where she says, tell me, you who my soul loves, where do you pasture? In other words, you want to see God, you have to look to where God pastures you. God pasturing you means God is leading you. So that's one type of place where you could recognize God, where you sense that God is involved in your life and leading you to where you need to be. Sometimes you could sense that. But there are other times in your life where you cannot sense that, because in that time, it's like the midday. You're in this distress, this pain, and what happens in midday? The shepherd doesn't take care of the sheep. The shepherd doesn't take the sheep to graze. Instead, the shepherd goes for shelter. So midday represents those times where we don't see the shepherd. We don't feel that the shepherd is present in our life. And that's what the verse is saying. The verse is saying that there are two ways. She says, where can I find you? And she understands that there's two places to look for him. She could look for him either, in other words, there's two different categories of one's life. One is that you feel God's presence in your life, and one is that you don't. But if you don't, then what do? What happens if you don't see God in your life? So then you have to understand that God is hiding. In other words, you have to look for God within the laws of nature. And that's what she's saying. Follow the footsteps of the sheep. Understand that you don't see God, but God is still directing the world through the laws of nature, even though you don't see the shepherd presence. But if you follow the sheep and you see how things are running and the world is moving forward, you will then sense the presence of God. So that's the Kabbalistic perspective. The Kabbalistic perspective, again, is that the soul is looking for the presence of God. And it says you can't see God himself, but you could see God through seeing how he operates within this world. And there's two categories. Sometimes you could see God directly. You could see God's divine intervention. You sense that God is helping you. Sometimes you don't sense that God is helping you. You just see the laws of nature. But then you have to understand that even that is an expression of God, because God works through the laws of nature. That is so far we did the historic perspective and the Kabbalistic perspective. Now we're going to get to the spiritual perspective. Now we get to the Kabbalistic perspective and the Hasidic perspective, which flips everything upside down. But in the meantime, if anybody has any questions or comments, please share. Otherwise, l'chaim. Okay, so to get to the Hasidic perspective, I'm quoting now, not from Rabbi Schneur Zalman, who we usually quote, because he doesn't talk about these verses, at least not at great length. So I'm looking at his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, his grandson, and he wrote also Hasidic discourses on the Song of Songs, and I'm quoting from him. And this idea that he's going to elaborate upon is based on the Zohar, but the Zohar just gives a little bit of a touch, and then the Hasidic teachings elaborate upon it and explain what the Zohar is really saying. So if you want to think about the Zohar, you have to look back at the verse. Okay, so let me add, so we have to look back at the verse. Fine, let's look at the verse. Tell me, you whom my soul loves, where do you feed? Now that's a tricky, I don't know what translation. What does feed mean? Echa tir'eh literally means, where are you the ro'eh? Where are you the shepherd? Where are you shepherding? And that makes sense with the rest of the verse. Echa tabritz betzarayim, where do you rest the flocks at noon? So we're talking about the shepherd. But the Zohar says something radical. And the Zohar says something radical. It's radical on many levels. But if, again, a lot of times what the Kabbalah does, it just reads the verse literally. So you can read this verse literally, and it says as follows. Tell me, you whom my soul loves. So the soul, she is talking to him. The soul is talking to God. And the person tells God, where do you feed? So typically, we think about, and according to Rashi and according to the spiritual perspective, it's, where do you shepherd us? Where do you give us food? It's exile. We don't sense that you are leading us. You don't sense that you're providing for us. We feel like we have to survive amongst the nations. We need the other shepherds to help us. So the soul asks God, where are you? Where are you? How come you're not shepherding me? How come you're not giving me what I need? So this is the cry of the woman to her beloved, where are you? How come you're not here shepherding me, giving me what I need? That is the historic perspective and the spiritual perspective. Says the Zohar flips it. She says, no. The question here is, Echa tir'eh, where do you feed? How does God get food during the exile? God also needs sustenance. And during the exile, the question is, how does God survive? So this is not the question of asking, where is God for our sake? Like Rashi says, so we could survive. Where is God protecting us? No, the question is, God, how do you eat lunch? How do you eat breakfast? How do you survive during the exile? Now, it sounds very radical, but it's not so radical if you think about it. Because what is it based on? It's based on the verses that you have in the Torah. In the book of Numbers, toward the end, where the Torah says that the commandment is to offer 2 daily offerings every day, one in the morning, one at night. So the verse says clearly, Hashem speaks to Moshe, tell the Jewish people, et karbani, my fire, lachmi, my bread, leishai, for the fire, bring 2 offerings. Why? Because God needs bread. God needs to eat breakfast and supper twice a day. And the question now, so we're going to talk about it. So the Zohar just mentions this, and the Medrash mentions this. We're going to explain what that means. But that's what the Medrash is saying. The Medrash also talks about it because the Medrash says that in the Song of Songs, often the Jewish people are called Rayati, my spouse. But Rayati comes to the word my shepherd. And the Medrash says, we are God's provider. We're the shepherd. Not God is our shepherd. We're God's shepherd. Why? Because we feed him. Where do you see we feed him? Because the verse says we feed God twice a day, morning and night. So we have to figure out, what does that mean we can feed God? It's a radical statement. But that's what the Torah says, or a Torah alludes to. And the Medrash says it clearly. And the Kabbalah is going to explain it. So now, whatever that means, whatever food means, now the question becomes, we're in exile, we can't bring the offerings, not just the offerings, many of the commandments we cannot fulfill. So forget about how we're going to survive in the exile. That's Rashi's question. The Zohar's question is, we say, God, how are you going to survive? Because we're not performing the mitzvot. If we're not performing the mitzvot, God has no food. That's one account. Another account, that's on behalf of God. Another account is to think about it this way. Another way to think about it is, why do we go to exile? The simple story is, we did not fulfill the commandments, so we're sent into exile. Now, if you ask yourself a question, that is very counterproductive. Why? Because we did not fulfill the commandments. That's why God puts us in a situation where we can fulfill even fewer commandments. How is that going to help anybody? To the contrary, if we're not fulfilling the commandments, God should encourage us to fulfill, not take away the ability of our ability to fulfill commandments, first of all, by taking us away from Israel. So technically, we can't fulfill many of the commandments, but also by putting us in the stress of survival. And we don't have time to think about God because we're too busy trying to avoid the pogrom and trying to pay the bills. So the Zohar asks both questions. First of all, this is what the woman is asking. Eicha tireh, how do you get sustenance? We're not feeding you. What's the purpose of exile? How do you survive during exile? And also, if you could read it the other way, Eicha tireh, if you're not getting the sustenance, then ultimately, what's the purpose of the exile on behalf of the Jews? Yes, true, the Jews need punishment and the Jews need to be rehabilitated, but that you're not helping the situation by allowing fewer mitzvot to be performed. Now, this is radical because, like I said, it's not new. It's in the Zohar and it's in the Medrash, but it's basically saying that typically we think of the Torah and the mitzvot as why do we do the Torah? For our benefit. God doesn't need anything. God is complete, and that's true. But when we fulfill the Torah, we're helping ourselves, and that's what the Mishnah teaches. For example, the Mishnah teaches that God wanted the Jewish people to be meritorious. God wanted the Jewish people to be able to be more refined. So He gave us the Torah and the mitzvot to refine us. But it's primarily for our benefit. Here, the Zohar points out that the Medrash says, and the verse says, God has a need. I know it's hard to say because it's theologically problematic. So we're going to explain what that means, that God has a need. God has a need. God needs breakfast. Who is going to provide for you, God, breakfast during exile? That's the question from the perspective of the Zohar. And now the Hasidic interpretation is going to make an attempt to explain what the Zohar is saying, because the Zohar doesn't really explain it. And the Zohar doesn't explain the response either. The Zohar just says, God says, you cannot understand, and that's not for you to know. But the Hasidic movement is going to take it a step further and try to explain both the question, both the meaning of what God needs dinner, needs food, and also the answer of seemingly the Zohar's question is a great question. How does God survive? If you establish that He does need food for survival, then who's feeding Him during the exile? Okay, so far I see nobody hung up the phone, even though I tried to say radical things. Everybody is still here. Oh, almost everybody. I guess for somebody it was too radical. But that's okay. Okay, at least most of the people are still here. You're still going to talk to me after today. That's good. That's good. Very reassuring. What does it mean that God needs food? That's really the elephant in the room. And once we solve that puzzle, we can start thinking about the other questions that this interpretation raises. So what is the function of food? So we have physicians here. We're not going to get into all the biology here, but in short, what food does is it strengthens the body, which then allows the soul to connect to the body. In other words, does the soul need breakfast? Of course not. But if the soul wants to be connected to the body, if the soul wants to live with the body, the soul needs breakfast. In other words, food is what connects the soul and the body. Apply that to God. You need a process that will allow the infinity of God to enter the finite world, because that is not a natural transition. And what creates that is the Torah and the mitzvot, specifically the offerings, but in general, the Torah and the mitzvot, the offerings, it sort of awakens God's desire to want to limit Himself, to have a relationship with the finite world. So now, when I say God needs breakfast, I don't mean God needs breakfast. Without breakfast, God would be weak and would dissipate. No, but without breakfast, the soul, God, who's the soul of the world, would not be connected with the world, and the world would cease to exist. The world would cease to have the light of God within itself. So that's the meaning of when God says, it's a very interesting metaphor. He says, I need bread, I need food. What does food mean? It's not that I need something from you. The soul will be perfectly fine without the body. Oh, but you want me to be invested in the world, then I need food, then I need the reason to connect. I need that bridge. And the bridge is the people doing God's will, which then allows for God to desire for the infinite light to come and express itself in a finite way. Now, Kabbalistically speaking, it's not just bringing God into this world, but in the Kabbalah, there are 4 spiritual worlds, beginning with the highest world, and there are 10 sfirot. And this world ultimately gets sustenance from the 10 sfirot. But the 10 sfirot are also finite, right? And God is infinite. So for God to want to limit Himself and express Himself with 10 sfirot in order to eventually create the world, that needs food. The food is the commandments. And now the question becomes, if during exile we cannot fulfill the commandments, specifically the offerings, but many of the commandments we cannot fulfill, and even those that we could fulfill, because of the distractions of exile, either physical distractions or distractions, more of a spiritual distractions by other cultures and foreign cultures. Echatira, God, how do you sustain? How do you survive? How do you sustain yourself? How are you fed when we are not together? That is a wonderful question that the woman asks her beloved, that the Jewish people ask God. And it's such a good question that the Zohar says there's no answer. And we're not telling you the answer. God says, none of your business. You just do what you got to do. You just follow the sheep, meaning the Medrash says, follow the paths of your ancestors. And that's all you have to occupy yourself with. But that's not enough for the Hasidic interpretation. The Hasidic interpretation wants to really understand how indeed does the world go on in exile if we're not feeding God. If the guy doesn't eat, he gets weaker and weaker. Ultimately, the soul would pass from the body and there'll be no connection. What's the purpose of this? I know the Jewish people need therapy. They have to go to exile for their own benefit. But how is the world going to survive? How is God going to eat? It's a wonderful question. Now, I'm going to give you the answer in 3 minutes, but the Tzemach Tzedek has about 10 pages on this. So when we finish the first round of Song of Songs, we can always go back and dig a little deeper. I'm just running up against the clock here. Comments, questions, welcome. And then we get to the answer of the Tzemach Tzedek it's also alluded to in verse, I believe it was verse 9, but I have to double check.
Well, Rabbi, I do have a question, but maybe it will be answered later. Because let's say the fuel for Hashem's desire to keep creating the world is in the mitzvot, and if we don't perform them and we don't have opportunity, so it's the vicious cycle. The desire can weaken. Is that the problem?
Yeah. So I have a problem. My child, I'm not going to name my children. I don't want to shame them, but a child doesn't want to eat. Okay. So what are you going to say? You don't want to eat. You know what? The punishment is we're taking away all your food. You're not helping the situation. You're making it worse, right? So we did not feed God. We did not provide the food that would connect the infinite light of God with the world. That's the metaphor of food. So God says, you know what? I'm sending it into exile. What's into exile? Even fewer opportunities to do a mitzvah, even fewer opportunities to feed God, even fewer opportunities for us to do a mitzvah. Then the question becomes, so what? It makes no sense. So what's the purpose of this? How are you surviving? And how is this helping us in what we really need? We really need more food. If your kid is not eating, you got to give him more food, not less food. So the whole concept of exile is problematic. We understand it's necessary. There's a benefit. There has to be reward and punishment, but you're not going to say the punishment for a child not eating is give him less food. It just doesn't.
But how did God survive before he created the world? There was an initial desire to create the world.
Okay. You're onto something, but 1 second. Before he created the world, there was no need to food because there was no body. You see what's happening here? Now, what is food? Food is connect the body and soul, connect God to the world. But you're right. Initially, Kabbalah talks about this, that initially the desire to create was initiated from Hashem himself. But Hashem wants that we, every year, should recreate that desire. And we do that on Rosh Hashanah, as you know, because you're a Kabbalist. And we discuss this every year, because that's the Kabbalah of Rosh Hashanah. But that's sort of one element that we do it through the shofar. But what about every day? The Torah says, God says, please feed me in the morning and at night. It's a verse in the Torah. And the Medrash says what I'm saying very clearly. The Medrash says, quoting the verse in the Song of Songs, Rayati, the Jewish people are God's spouse, but the word spouse has many, we'll see when we get there. There are many descriptions for spouse in Hebrew. One is the one who provides what I need and provides me sustenance and is my shepherd. And we're the shepherds of God and we're supposed to feed him. What does it mean feed him? We can't feed him. God is infinite. He's complete. We can't give anything to an infinite God. Yeah, but what we could do is connect the infinite to the finite, because we're in the business of the finite, right? And now the question becomes: there's no exile. Who's connecting the infinity of light to this world? And the issue is like this. The issue is that I literally have 3 minutes, but I'll give the metaphor. And the metaphor is like this. The metaphor is sometimes food is not good. Sometimes giving food doesn't help. When is that? When a person is ill. The body, giving it food is not going to help. The body does not know how to digest and how to internalize the sustenance and the minerals and the nutrition that is within the food. What do you need then? Then you need medicine. So what is the answer? The answer is that in the exile, we have a little food. You got to eat something. We do some commandments to connect the infinite light to the finite world. But what we do need, much more powerful than food, is the medicine. And the medicine will then allow for the food to be digested. What is the medicine? The medicine is either intense love of God, I don't want to get into the level here, but you have love of God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. With all your might is a tremendously intense love of God. But some Tzedek says, well, not everybody has on that level. So let's be more practical. The medicine is the attribute of netzach, the attribute of victory. We have 10 divine attributes, and those divine attributes are reflected in our soul. Everybody has the attribute of victory. The attribute of victory is something within you is designed to get excited and get awakened when there's an obstacle and you have to overcome the obstacle. You have people, so many examples for this, but there are people that so many examples. One example is you have two siblings, they don't talk to each other. When there's an obstacle, then my love is awakened to my sibling because there's an obstacle that has to be overcome. There's some people that need obstacle to be able to, when they thrive during obstacle, during challenge. And according to the Kabbalah, the attribute of netzach, the attribute of victory, of overcoming obstacle, is rooted very deep within the soul. And there are examples. There's a metaphor. The metaphor is when you go to war, when a king goes to war, he's going to spend all his treasures to overcome the obstacle, to overcome the opposition. And it's not logical. If you think about the calculation of return on the investment, it's not always logical. But because the soul has an ability and a desire to overcome the obstacle, overcome the challenge, and that's rooted very deep within the soul, that part of the soul is triggered and awakened specifically during exile. In other words, the fact that we are in exile and we are face challenge, and everybody faces challenge, either physically or spiritually or morally, everybody is going to face challenge in exile. And if we overcome the challenge, and we have to find that strength to overcome the challenge, that is the medicine. And indeed, in exile, we have less of the food, but we have more of the medicine. And that is what is the conversation between the woman and her beloved during the time of exile, at least according to the Zohar and Hasidic commentary. Let's read the verses. The verse says, he says, where are you? Tell me, you whom my soul loves. Where do you feed? Where do you rest the flocks at noon? For why should I be like the one who veils herself beside the flocks of my companions? We're busy. Veil yourself as I'm surrounded. Veil is surrounded. I'm surrounded by the culture of the other nations, of the other shepherds. So I cannot feed you. So if I cannot feed you, God, where are you feeding? And the answer is that, like I said, the answer is God is feeding less during the exile, doing less eating and more medicine. And therefore, the fact that we follow the footsteps of the flocks beside the shepherds' dwellings, in other words, amongst and between the challenges of the surrounding cultures, and nevertheless, we still follow the footsteps of our ancestors who were shepherds. So that's the reference to follow the steps of the flocks. And when we pasture our kids, our young goats, beside the shepherds' dwellings, that's the answer of where I am. It says, where are you? It says, right now we need medicine. We don't need food. And you're going to say, how am I going to survive amongst the challenges? That's what we need now. Now we need to awaken that part of the soul that can overcome challenge. And that's really what God wants more. And Rabbi Tzemach Tzedek does bring what Vicky says, just like we see that sometimes God is awakened not by food, but by other issues, just like in the beginning of creation. He's also awakened by the commitment that the Jewish people display to overcome the challenges. And that's even more powerful than the food. So that is, like I said, I'm condensing literally 10 pages of Hasidic philosophy into, about 6 minutes? But the purpose of our getting together, I guess, is to wet the tongue and to see the beauty and eventually to explore further. Next week, I'll give you the hint. You shouldn't be disappointed because she says, where are you? You're not answering my phone call. So he doesn't answer. Next week, he sends her how many verses? 1, 2, 3. 3 verses of love letters to pacify her for the fact that he's not showing up. But he says, you know what? I'm still interested in the relationship. So he sends her 3 text messages, verse 9, 10, and 11, praising her. And that's our job, is to figure out, to unpack what exactly he's praising her with. But again, I like to think about each verse in the context of the overall story. The overall story is she desires her. She has a great desire for him. She tells the nations, she tells the other girls, don't judge me. I'm more beautiful than you think. And then she says, where are you? And he says, I'm not telling you where I am, but I'll send you love letters. And that's what he does. That's 9, 10, and 11. And then the verse continues. And then the story continues. So this is just a taste, and I hope everybody enjoyed. I enjoyed. Thank you for joining. This is real fun for me. Any comments, questions, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day, wonderful Shabbos. And don't forget that on Sunday night starts Shavuot, Monday, Tuesday, Shavuot. That's when we receive the Torah. And according to the Medrash, based on a verse in the Song of Songs that we're reading now, that the day of the marriage between God and the Jewish people is the day of that we receive the Torah. So this entire story about the romantic relationship between God and the Jewish people is really the story of Shavuot in a sense.
Thank you, Rabbi. I do have a quick question about the Netzach. How do we strengthen it? Is Torah study helping us to do that?
Ironically, we don't have to awaken it. The challenge is awaken it.
Yeah.
Right? So people, when they're challenged, they discover deeper power that they never knew they had. Well, how could I do this? How was I able to do this? I didn't think I could. So Netzach, it's a funny trait. It's triggered by the opposition. You're playing basketball, and all of a sudden the other team is winning. All of a sudden you start playing better. Why? Because you got to win. Why do you have to win? But something in your soul is designed to overcome obstacle and to awaken you when you overcome obstacle and awaken you. And the attribute of victory will surprise you because you don't think that you're able to achieve that by yourself. But when you're in survival mode, survival, that's more evolutionary. I mean to say when there's the mode of overcoming opposition, that's when the soul is touched deep.
Thank you.
Netzach is rooted very high in the soul. Okay, wonderful day, wonderful Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.